Did you know that America's first presidential inauguration was delayed by about 2 months? One huge factor, one huge cause, was the frigid weather in New York City. No, this wasn't in Washington, D.C. And have you heard of President Atchison, who was purportedly the President of the United States for just one day? You all know the news. Mr. Trump's inauguration has moved indoors because of the freezing temperatures and the blizzard in Washington, D.C. The weather, political crises, violence, constitutional amendments, botched recitations of the oath have all impacted our presidential inauguration and its date. So, stay with me as I peel the history behind America's presidential inaugurations. Welcome to History Behind News. I'm Adel Aali, your host. This is not just a history program, and it's not at all a news program. I interview scholars from all over the world, 150 and counting, who distill their many decades of research into an hour conversation to explain to us in rich detail and with fascinating stories how we got to our current moment in history. So my guest scholars help me peel the history behind developments and trends we're told about or should be told about in our news. Donald Trump's second inauguration is taking place indoors in the Capitol Rotunda on Monday, January 20th, 2025. His first inauguration took place on Friday, January 20th, 2017, and it was outdoors. But here's the thing. Until Franklin Delano Roosevelt's second inauguration in 1937, presidential inaugurations were on March 4th, not on January 20th.
Just sort of a quirk in the calendar for the passage of power in the federal government, right? So the 20th Amendment says that the new Congress begins and its first session starts on January 3rd, following an election year, and that the presidential inauguration takes place on January 20th.
That was Professor Shorstall, and I've dropped a link to my interview with him in the description of this episode. So, presidential inaugurations were held on or about March 4th, from 1789 to the 1930s. But there was nothing special about March 4th. And that date, March 4th, is certainly not written in our Constitution. The way it happened is that Congress, not the first U.S. Congress, this is the Congress that met under the Articles of Confederation in September 1788, said that the first Congress should start on the first Wednesday in March of 1789. And that Wednesday just happened to be on March 4th. Later in 1792, at the end of Washington's first term, Congress passed legislation for March 4th to become the official date of our presidential inauguration. And because of that, Washington's second inauguration took place in Philadelphia on March 4, 1793. But what about Washington's first inauguration? As I said at the top of the podcast, it didn't happen on March 4th. It happened on April 30th, 1789, which was a Thursday, in New York City. So it was delayed for about 2 months, and one factor was the weather. That winter, the winter of 1789, was particularly cold. So it wasn't just the president's inauguration that was delayed. That first Congress that I told you about also couldn't meet on March 4th. Because of the terrible weather, snow and sleet on bad roads, and many senators and U.S. representatives were coming from places that didn't even have roads. Because of that, the House of Representatives didn't even have a quorum on March 4th to conduct business. So the first U.S. Congress couldn't even really do anything until April 1st, when enough members came and they had a quorum and they started business about a month later after March 4th. By the way, I've often wondered why our founders chose winter to start government business when weather conditions were so bad in the East Coast? Why not have the president's inauguration or the start of a new Congress in the spring or summer? Interestingly, I haven't gotten a definitive answer to this question. And believe me, I've asked many scholars and been on the lookout for it in my readings, and perhaps I'm just digging too deep. But here are my thoughts. There are three factors, I think, to consider. The first one is that in the East Coast, in cities such as New York, Philadelphia, and later Washington, D.C., which have all been our nation's capital in that order, summers are terribly hot and humid. And in the old days, they didn't have air conditioning. There are many stories of suffocating heat, such as during the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, which happened behind closed doors because they wanted deliberations, discussions about the new Constitution they were forming to be in secret. And this happened from May 25 to September 1787, so summer months. And heat was a huge issue. The second factor may be that many members of Congress and even members of president's cabinets, such as the Attorney General, had jobs outside the government. So for politicians who owned farms and plantations, and many did, spring and summer months were important for crops, for doing personal business. And the third reason may be that March 4 was close enough to spring to get things started with the government. By the 1930s, when inauguration was pulled earlier in the winter to January 20th, of course, we had better roads and better transportation. But as you can see from Mr. Trump's second inauguration, nature is too powerful even for advanced technology. Now, there are several instances that March 4th fell on a Sunday, and in those instances, the inauguration would take place the next day, Monday, March 5th. But this practice created a funny situation in 1849. The inauguration of Zachary Taylor, our 12th president, was held on March 5, 1849, a Monday. But James Polk, our 11th president, was no longer president as of noon, March 4th. So, who was America's president between noon on Sunday, March 4th, to noon on Monday, March 5th? Remember at the top of the podcast, I asked if you've ever heard of President Atchison? Well, this is where David Rice Atchison, U.S. Senator from Missouri, comes into our History Behind News. The history of President Atchison, president for just one day. This is kind of a fun history. Atchison himself thought it was funny when another U.S. Senator woke him up at 3 a.m. to tell him he's the president of the United States. He certainly didn't take it seriously, but believe me, historians have deliberated about this, whether or not he was in effect the U.S. president for one day. You see, since the outgoing President Polk's vice president had relinquished his post as the president of the Senate, on March 2nd, Atchison, based on prior arrangement, became president pro tempore of the Senate, which is in line of succession for the presidency. So when for one day there was no president, one could argue, and many did, that he was in effect America's president for one day. Here's another March 4th presidential inauguration day that is not funny at all. I think it's very important for us to know this, for us to know this history for our democracy. And it's so important that I've actually done more than one interview about it. Here's Professor Foley.
But in terms of the fate of the nation as a whole being embroiled in a dispute, 1876 was very scary for those who went through it. And I'm afraid that the history, the average history class in college or high school doesn't bring to life the full drama and the momentousness of it. I mean, inauguration of the new president back then was on March 4th. We've changed it. We now do inauguration on January 20th. But the dispute was not resolved until March 2nd.
And here's Professor Schwartzel about March 4, 1877. Inauguration was on March 4, And we didn't have a president until when?
Till early in the morning on March 2nd. We didn't have a determination
Wow.
until early in the morning on March 2nd.
Wow. Okay. So, wow. So 2 days before inauguration, which takes us to the other ECA, Electoral Count Act of 1887. Another historian, Michael Belisiles, not a guest in my program, explains in his book titled 1877, America's Year of Living Violently, explains that as Inauguration Day, March 4th, 1787 approached, the potential for a violent attack on Washington, D.C. was so real that the outgoing President Grant, remember Grant, the hero of the Union, ordered a heavily armed ship, the Man of War Wyoming, to position itself in the Potomac River with its cannons trained on the two bridges connecting D.C. to Maryland and Virginia. And General Sherman, remember the Civil War Union hero, General William T. Sherman, he brought in more troops to D.C. and paraded them around on a daily basis in a show of force. Now, there's much more to tell you about the history of inauguration. For example, we know crowd sizes are important to Mr. Trump, so let's get into that quickly. Lyndon Johnson, LBJ, had the third largest inauguration crowd on Wednesday, January 20, 1965. The crowd was 1.2 million strong. Harry Truman had the second largest inauguration crowd on Thursday, January 20, 1949. It was 1.3 million. And the first prize goes to Barack Obama, who had the largest inauguration crowd on Tuesday, January 20, 2009. It was 1.8 million. Let's end with two stories about the weather. I won't get into the stats of which was the coldest inauguration, but in a post in the historybehindnews.com website, I've shared two wonderful photos. The first one is the photo of a snow-covered Washington, D.C. There's snow all around, and you can see members of the Secret Service walking along a carriage in which President-elect Taft is riding in and also the outgoing President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, are in it. And that's on Thursday, March 4, 1909. The second one is way more special. It's a rare picture of America that is becoming really difficult to find nowadays. A picture that shows how political adversaries respected each other and how they displayed grace and civility even when they lost. Here's Professor Gerhardt.
But one of the things that really stands out for me in the election, besides the fact that the country was entering into a depression, was how the two candidates treated each other. Harrison had defeated Cleveland. At the inauguration for Harrison, Cleveland holds up an umbrella over his head.
In this picture, which is also in the post in my website, historybehindnews.com, President Grover Cleveland, who had lost to Benjamin Harrison, holds an umbrella over Harrison during the rain, as Harrison, his adversary, takes the oath of office in his inauguration on Monday, March 4, 1889. Another interesting story that happened on that day is that President Cleveland's wife, Miss Frances Folsom Cleveland, as she was leaving the White House, she gathered the staff and she allegedly said to the White House staff, "Don't change anything, don't move the furniture, because we'll be back in 4 years." And sure enough, they were. 4 years later, Cleveland defeated Harrison and became our first president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. Mr. Trump is our second president to do that. I have a great interview planned for you this Friday, January 24th. I will be speaking to Dr. David Zarifsky of Northwestern University about President Trump's inauguration speech and his speaking style compared to other notable presidents in U.S. history.